Greetings and welcome to this installment of our HRM 300 series. This is going to be covering Chapter 9, where we're going to be talking about performance issues. Managing employee performance actually is the official name of the chapter. But we're going to be talking about employee management and how we deal with performance issues and also some other different types of performance topics. My name is Professor Kevin Matthews, and I am the professor for this class as of fall 2018. And so the first thing that we're going to do, again with the chapter, they give you a dilemma to get you in the mood. In this section, we're going to be talking about handling performance. The learning objectives are going to be explain the types of performance issues that occur in the workplace and the internal and external reasons for poor performance. Number 2 is understand how to develop a process for handling employee performance issues. And number 3, be able to discuss considerations for initiating layoffs or downsizing. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is different types of performance issues. And the book gives you a pretty good area, a pretty good outlay of this. And here's what I'm going to say. If you've been a manager at any point in your career, or even if you've just worked at a relatively medium-sized or large-sized organization, most of these you're probably going to see. And for example, constantly leaves early or late. You'll see people who try to do that. Too much time spent doing personal things at work. Inability to handle proprietary information, family issues, drug and alcohol abuse, non-performing, conflicts with management and or employees, theft, ethical breaches, harassment, employee conduct outside the workplace, and so on and so forth. And so just kind of going into this a little bit, some of these I'm not really going to talk about because, they're very self-explanatory. Very example, constantly arrives late or leaves early. That's pretty self-explanatory. You know what it is. Of course, too much time spent doing personal things at work. I've seen, with some organizations, as they rise up in the organization, they tend to be a little more forgiving of people doing that, mostly because there's an idea that management usually spends so much time outside of the workplace doing a whole lot of work-related stuff, they kind of give them a little bit of a break. But it also depends on the organization. Very good example, I own the organization, so I pretty much do whatever I want. But if I had somebody coming to work for me and they were an intern, my theory is you clock in, you work for me, you're not searching the internet, you're not looking stuff up that's personal or anything of that nature, and then when you clock out, you can go do whatever it is that you want. I have no right to touch you, or hand anything to you after you leave the workplace. That's as you move up in the organization, particularly when you move from hourly to salary, that sort of expectation kind of starts to go away and start to erode a little bit. The next one that they talk about, inability to handle proprietary information. This has really become an issue probably within the last 10 years. There have been more and more people that have been talking about, privacy issues. I remember in the late 90s, this started to become an issue because of HIPAA. HIPAA being the Portability Act for healthcare, and what HIPAA did is that it basically did a whole wide range of things. But one of the things that it definitely did is that it made mishandling of privacy information that's related to healthcare or health issues. It made it a crime, and so in basically punishable by fines, and if it's willfully intentful, I think it could go even further than that. Although I've never seen anybody who's wanted to do something like that, so I've never experienced it. But later on, especially in the federal government, PII, it almost became, I would say not almost, I would say it became as serious as classified material at one point. That if you mishandled PII, it was seen as a very, very bad thing. I don't know if the military is still going through that. I'm pretty sure that they are, because the idea is that if you can't handle PII correctly, you're probably not going to be able to handle the higher level stuff correctly, and so sometimes they sort of infer that from people. Family issues, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We've all probably had that one friend who's had some family problems. My family, I'll be honest, was sort of the home of drama. When I was much younger. Luckily, I know my family, that part of the family is on the other side of the country, so I don't have to deal with it anymore. But, most of my family, is really good, but there's just that one or two members that we have to deal with periodically that it's just like, oh my God, what is it again? And sometimes you'll have that, there's one person at work that just seems to always have an issue or seems to always have something. And and it can actually be a real drag down. Now, what is it you're going to do about it with HR? Sometimes you need to be the person who sits down with them at the lunch table and say, hey, look, let's chat about this. This is where we kind of get away from what your absolute responsibilities are and more towards just ways that you can serve the organization and make things better. I remember when I was younger, there was a lot of drama in my life, and as a result of which, a lot of people. I had one person who sat down with me and said, Kevin, we can't do this anymore. And so it kind of made me realize that there were certain people in my life that were toxic, and I had to stay away from them. And that, I think, was a very helpful thing. And sometimes realizing the toxicity of certain people in your life can be a turning point for certain people who might not otherwise realize it because it's finally pointed out to them. Drug and alcohol abuse, 40% of industry fatalities and 47% of industry injury can be tied to alcohol consumption. And here's the thing, alcohol, obviously we talk about drug abuse because, things like cocaine, heroin, all that stuff, it's obviously illegal. So, of course, when people start going down that path, it really becomes a big issue for the company, not just in terms of, obviously hurting work performance. We're talking actual safety issues. But alcohol is just as dangerous. There's, when people show up to the job and they're still drinking, or they keep the nice flask in the middle, and on the thing when they're operating the machinery because, maybe it's a little cold outside and there's that misconception about alcohol that it warms you up. What happens is people end up becoming a lot less productive, but more importantly, it can also create safety issues, and so we want to keep that in mind. They also make an issue down here, not only illegal drugs, but also prescription drugs. We've seen that become more and more rampant lately as people are abusing opioids, which sometimes can be misprescribed. Non-performing, people are just not at 100%. We experience this in the accounting industry quite frequently because during tax season, probably from about the middle of January all the way through April 15th, we're putting people through the ringer. 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, for 2.5 months. I remember during my last tax season, I hadn't sat down and had dinner with my family for almost a month and a half straight. And so once I got done with tax season, I took about a week and I'm like, I'm going back to my family. I'm not talking to anybody. Periodically, I was going to check things to make sure that if there were any e-file rejects, I was going to have to deal with because the IRS gives you 5 days to handle that. That's just stuff that we end up having to worry about. So what ended up happening is, you can have those non-performing issues, but I would say where they're probably alluding to in this book, more importantly, is where you just have employees who just have no motivation. We've talked about that in assignment 1 and 2 about motivating people. The problem I have with motivation and non-performance is sometimes that's difficult to measure. And so, if you work in an industry where there's so many widgets being performed per minute or per hour or whatever, and you can measure that, that's definitely a good way to quantify sometimes non-performing work. But if I work, say I'm a lawyer, and say, I normally used to creating 20 contracts at a time, and now I'm down to 12. Well, that could also be seasonally related, and so sometimes it gets, or you could be handling more difficult contracts. There could be other things that could be justified in order to do that. So, again, I would say, be careful that you actually can measure them correctly in order to be able to set things up correctly. Conflicts with manager or other employees, that's self-explanatory. I won't go into it. Theft. Theft is a serious issue. They don't talk about it, but of course embezzlement. We see, you know, and probably the most dangerous thing I've seen in the accounting industry is petty cash. Petty cash has been used to cause so many embezzlements out of a company, and you know, it's just, you know, the way that it gets set up, and so sometimes petty cash isn't reconciled correctly, and as a result of which, you know, I didn't actually perform this audit, but I talked to a partner once who had been on an audit where one of the partners at a doctor's firm had laundered, or not laundered, but embezzled somewhere in the neighborhood of almost $250,000 over 20 years through petty cash. Where basically he had been taking money from his partners and of course from the company. Now you might say, well, as an owner of an organization, he's entitled to part of that, but that's not really necessarily the case. And so, you know, that embezzlement is actually, you know, I mean, it hurts other people, and then it also can hurt the morale of the company if that ever gets discussed. You know, ethical breaches, they talk about lying, withholding information, abusive behavior, reporting, misreporting work hours is a list of things that they talk about with ethical breaches. That can obviously have a quantitative cost, but it can also have a qualitative cost where it brings down morale when you find out, you know, there was an old joke that we used to say in the Navy, this year's #1 recruiter will be this year or next year's first to step in line for non-judicial punishment. Because usually you find out the reason why they were the #1 recruiters because they were making a lot of shortcuts, and as a result of which they had high numbers. Now, when I was at recruiting command, that never happened, but there was, you know, there was definitely some recruiters who said that they had noticed that sometimes the #1 recruiter last year usually ends up going to an NJP by next year. Harassment, and you know, we're obviously in today's Me Too movement, we're talking about sexual harassment a lot, but there's other types of harassment. They talk about bullying. And then there's other types of harassment where making people feel uncomfortable for various things. And, you know, I think that there's a difference between harassment and sort of like an unintentional type of harassment. We haven't talked too much about this yet. I don't know if we get to it later on in this chapter or not. But the fragrance-free zones. There's people who like to wear cologne, and there's a special type of cologne that they have, and some people are very allergic to that, and as a result of which, it prevents them from performing in a way that's possible to their best of their abilities. Now, what ends up happening is, as the HR person, sometimes you have to sit down with the person and says, look, we appreciate that you want to smell wonderful for the rest of us. But we have a couple employees here who are very allergic to whatever it is you're putting in your cologne. Can you please either A, switch to something else, or B, we're just going to have to do fragrance-free zones. And it's kind of funny because I remember when I was in school, for one of my degree programs, I won't say which one, but I remember we had talked about fragrance-free zones, and one of the people in my class basically had said, you know, I really wish we would have instigated one of these past year, because so-and-so who sits, you know, a few places down always walks in smelling of perfume to holy high heck, and as a result of which it prevents me from working hard. It's kind of interesting that it can affect us both in school but also in the workplace. You know, and then the other thing is employee conduct outside the workplace. You know, and with the advent of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all that stuff, there's a wide variety of things. I mean, even YouTube. I know I'm shooting videos for YouTube. If I perform, you know, if I do misconduct in making these videos, I can really make UMUC look real bad. And so, you know, I always have to do this, or I'm kind of being careful about that. And you might see that, you know, there's several things that I've done in my life to make sure that I'm always kind of making myself aware of various things. For example, when I send out emails to everybody, I always say, sincerely, Prof. That reminds me as I'm typing it to go back and take a look and say, look, I am a professor. This person I'm talking to is a student. I need to make sure that I'm saying things that are appropriate in order to prevent any issues. And so that's just little things like that that actually help me out. And of course, when I'm building these videos, I put the introduction, which talks about UMUC. I put the conclusion, which talks about UMUC. And so it kind of brings me into my mind that says, is this product really going to harm UMUC in any way, shape, or form? And I've, so far, you know, I mean, I haven't had any need to do it, but it does, it is just something that's kind of a check in my mind. What influences performance? Okay, so when an employee isn't performing as expected, it can be disappointing. Considering the amount of time it takes to hire, blah, blah, blah. Some factors can be internal, others may be external. So they give you a list of internal factors, which I'm going to put on the screen here. And then there's also some external factors, which I'll put on the screen that follows here. So all the internal reasons speak to the importance, once again, of hiring the right person to begin with. And we kind of talked about this when we did the recruiting section. I said you want to put a lot of time and effort sort of into figuring out who it is that you want to do, but that's why we do all the preparation. We do the job analysis, we do the job descriptions, we do everything in order to make sure that we're hiring the right person for the right job. And so we want to make sure that all of that gets done correctly. Defining discipline. If an employee is not meeting the expectations, discipline might need to occur. And I've had a few times where we've had to execute disciplinary procedures. Obviously in the military we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, which allows us to do what we would call administrative punishments or non-judicial punishments. Captain's mass is what we call it in the Navy. Office hours is what the Marine Corps calls it. I don't know what the Air Force and the Navy and the Army calls theirs. But basically, it's a procedure to punish people who are not behaving within the rules and the confines that are set with them. Obviously, in the civilian world, there's no captain's mass. So what we have is that we have certain guidelines that we're going to follow when we're going to create a disciplinary process. And so, all rules and procedures should be in a written document whenever possible. Rules should be related to safety and productivity of the organization. Rules should be written clearly so no ambiguity occurs between different managers. Supervisors, managers, human resource should communicate clearly the rules and orientation, training, and via other methods. And rules should be revised periodically as the organization's needs change. And I think that the orientation is a very good thing, because then you can kind of iron out a lot of differences that people may have in terms of understanding, and make sure that people have a dissimilar understanding. Because I could read a sentence, somebody else from a different culture in our multiculturalism aspect of things might look at it and read it into it differently. And so we just want to make sure that we're getting everybody on the same page so that we can make sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. Then they talk a little bit about wrongful termination, which is when an employer has fired or laid off an employee for illegal reasons. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but one of the reasons why we try to have these rules and have them written down is that way we can go back to the employee and say, look, this is the writing of the rule. You know what the writing of the rule is, and this was in your orientation, or you attended this training that talked about this, and you violated the rule. So, we're going to start the disciplinary procedures. And so on and so forth. So the role of performance appraisal in the disciplinary process. Now, when we talk about performance appraisals, there's been some change in the industries over time. In the beginning, they really focused on annual performance appraisals, and we probably talked about this in a previous video, or I may have talked about it in a previous class and just not in this class, where old organizations, old HR systems would have performance appraisals that are actually going to be done annually. And we don't want that. We want more frequent feedback to people. Sometimes just a simple, hey, great job. Great, thank you very much for getting this done, can go a long way. I tend to be one that overpraises in public and then criticizes in private. So it's not necessarily been a problem in the past, but sometimes if you don't praise often enough, sometimes people just say, okay, and of course there's a theory. Well, should I really be praising people for just doing what they're supposed to be doing in the first place? I had one manager that I remember I said, hey, I got this thing taken care of, and she I guess she got a little snarky with me and said, oh, well, do you want praise for doing what you were supposed to do in the first place? And I'm kind of thinking to myself, well, yeah, it'd be kind of nice. At least just show that you're appreciative of what it is. So I kind of take that experience that I had with her and I apply it in my life to this very day. So it's very good. So now we're going to talk about the performance issue model. And basically what they've done is they've given you sort of 5 steps, and they're different levels of of different performance issues that take place. So in the first one, they talk about the mandated issue, which is serious and must be addressed immediately. Very good example. They give you sexual harassment or something that can be others that can break the law, like safety procedures or violating privacy posts, especially, like I said, violating HIPAA by putting patient stuff online. Very good example. If you have somebody, if you're in a hospital and somebody famous is staying at your hospital because they got injured, actually telling everybody on Facebook that they were staying at your hospital is a violation of HIPAA. And so you want to make sure that you are monitoring that and doing things appropriately. The second performance issue can be called a single incident. It's when an employee misspeaks or insults some colleague, or perhaps they were over budget or late on a project. These incidents are usually best solved with casual conversation. And so, I like to call it the whoops-a-daisy. And there's been some times where I'm just a little perturbed with somebody, then I'd probably say something I shouldn't have done. Usually within 30 seconds of saying that, I kind of know, okay, yeah, I shouldn't say that. Now, I may not go to them immediately and apologize, but I will eventually go to them and say, look, I really didn't mean that. I've been married 15 years. I know how to beg and grovel in order to get back in good graces with people. It just kind of gets to that where, I admit my mistake and try real hard in order not to do that again. Now, they say single incidences are not if not immediately corrected, they can evolve into behavior patterns. So, for example, if I get snarky with somebody and nobody corrects me about it, I might be under the perception that there's other people who feel that getting snarky with that individual is justified. And as a result of which, I might become a snarky individual when talking to this one person. That kind of becomes into a behavior pattern which we want to make sure that it is corrected. And again, with a single incident, a casual conversation, we can deal with that. Behavior pattern, sometimes we need to sit down and do oral counseling, where it's, maybe it's, we make a note in the record that just counseling took place. We don't really talk too much about what the incident was. Or maybe just a broad topic, as opposed to like a written counseling. With a written counseling, there should be a formal form that's written out that basically says, this is what you did, this is what the circumstances were, blah, 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 here's the date, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and you kind of go down the thing. And there's a misconception, I think, between oral counseling and written counseling, and that oral is never written down. I would disagree with that. I think oral needs to be at least somewhat written down, at least document that it took place. Because what ends up happening is you'll have oral counseling where you correct somebody on something. 4 to 6 months goes by, you completely forget about the incident, as a result of which, we got to do oral counseling because this person hasn't had that before. And someone says, no, wait, they had this before. Or are you sure it was this person, not this? See, so it just gets very confusing very quickly, and it's better to make sure that you're doing that. If they don't self-correct, they talk about if the behavior pattern continues to exhibit the same behavior, we call it a persistent pattern. Where now you're basically getting to the fact that, this is getting more and more serious, and then eventually we get to the disciplinary intervention, which is where we're going to be talking about, hey, look, this is where we're going to have to drop some hammers in order to make sure that this behavior gets corrected. Investigation of performance issues. I want to tell you something. I've worked in many, many companies throughout my time. With the exception of the Navy, I've probably only seen 2 that really had a formal investigative process. And I've had one of those 2 that did the investigative process as they should have, because a claim of harassment was taking place, but they really didn't do it seriously. Basically what had happened is the individual who was accused was favorites with one of the senior managers, and as a result of which it kind of went away, which is one reason why I don't work at that organization anymore. I won't say which one it is, but I felt that they kind of just, they went through the motions just so they could say, yeah, we did this, but they mishandled this grossly. So But one thing I really liked about my experience in the Navy, I actually got to investigate several performance issues during this time. You know, I don't know if I should really go into too much detail as to what was taking place, but I remember, you know, there was, you know, it was a formalized process, and the whole goal was for me to figure out what's going on, and based upon my investigation, if I was able, and I did actually find out that they did wrong. I didn't believe the guy who was, you know, the accused. The accused story was, I think he basically was full of it. And then the accomplice that was helping him out came back to us and said, you know, I'm not going to fry for this, and so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rat the other person out. And then, you know, then we've come to find out that his story wasn't exactly 100% accurate either. But by then, the other person had confessed that he was part of it. But, you know, he said, but this person's not telling the full truth either. Here's part of what it is. And that's usually what ends up happening in one of these investigations. In that person's case, one person lost a career and the other person lost a stripe. And so that's just kind of how that took place. You know, and so you want to make sure that you document, and they give you the 8 things that are supposed to be documented. This is very, very serious when talking about unions. Okay, because when you're dealing with unions, the problem that you're going to run into with unions is that a lot of times disciplinary processes have been negotiated, and so there's a specific process you have to follow, whether you want to or not. You know, if there's a minor issue that comes up, but it says, you know, say for example, there's a, you know, it's a safety incident, but what happened was somebody forgot to put the pin back into the fire extinguisher. Is that going to cause the entire thing to go off and spread fire extinguisher you know, chemicals all over the place? Probably not, because many fire extinguishers usually have 1 or 2 safety things in order to do it. But if you know, if you've agreed that the safety procedures all have to be followed in a certain way, something like that versus, you know, somebody leaving out, you know, and I'll give you another example, because when I was in Japan this happened. Somebody was using nitric acid to clean off uranium at a nuclear power plant, and was violating probably about 7 or 8 different procedures, and as a result of which caused a major you know, contamination of the air of this plutonium, and as a result of which, you know, obviously that person, you know, well, he was dead. I mean, he died, unfortunately, because of the exposure to radiation. His suit didn't protect him, but the second person who was involved obviously lost his job. I don't think, you know, he was one of his managers. And so, you know, obviously you can tell, you know, the difference between, you know, a pin not being put in the fire extinguisher versus nitric acid on plutonium. Vastly different issues, but sometimes what will happen is those procedures are going to be negotiated. You have to follow them whether you want to or not. Because if you don't, what ends up happening is, if you don't follow it for the little procedure that ends up happening, and then the big procedure ends up happening, you want to follow it, the union can come back to you and say you're improperly, you know, wantonly choosing when to enforce the rules and when not to enforce the rules. So oftentimes that ends up happening. Now, I understand there's probably some wiggle room, but again, you know, you've got to follow whatever the union contract does. So then they got the options for handling performance issues, and they give you a pretty good thing down here. They talk about first offense, second offense, third offense, fourth offense, and so on and so forth. The only problem I had with first offense, second offense, I don't think it necessarily, I think you've got to create a matrix if you're going to do this. And I think that, you know, there has to be, and it's got to have number of incidences that have taken place, and then on the other side is seriousness of the offense. And if you can set something up like that, I think it ends up working out better for you, because what you end up doing is you end up not having the problems of For example, like I said, if you've got somebody who's pouring nitric acid on something and as a result of which it causes a disaster, that person, termination is obviously a fit. But if you don't have the matrix set up for this, they'll be like, he never did anything wrong in his life. All of a sudden he's being fired for, somebody under him, and then they're trying to justify themselves on this. I think it's better to have that matrix in order to be able to figure that out. And that's usually the way that I recommend developing it. Then they talk about the 7 tests of just cause, which is, is a practical and efficient way to determine whether a proposed disciplinary action is firmly and fairly grounded. And this is sort of a developed system in order to determine this that they developed for the University of Iowa. It's a very good read. I think it's a good way to approach it. Again, I like the matrix system better. On 9.2, they give you a sample performance improvement plan, where this is where you're having they call these PIPs. I've seen PIPs before. I've actually been put on a PIP once before, and I recovered nicely and never had any issues with it. Sometimes, generally speaking, PIPs are not not career ending. They're not supposed to be, at least. It's not like, when I was in the military, if somebody came by and gave me something like a PIP and I was a commissioned officer, usually it's the end of a career. But I've met people who were managing directors at the Big Four who had gone through a PIP. And so sometimes it's just like, hey, look, we're seeing some things that we're not happy with. We want to correct those. Let's go through these things, and then we'll see how things go. And I'll be honest, one of the reasons why was because I thought, I was, the bomb. And so they put me through a PIP. I gained a little bit of humility as a result of it, and everything worked out really well. In fact, I eventually ended up leaving the organization, not as a result of the PIP, but for other reasons. And the person that I worked for at the time basically was like, hey, I think you've been doing phenomenal. I wish there's a way we can convince you to stay. That's how it needs to go. And so if you put people on a PIP, the idea is, it's basically the ship is going in the wrong direction. We want you to go to the right direction. We're going to get you back on course, then we're going to have you proceed as is. Because if PIPs become career-ending things, there's no sense to having a PIP, because it's not performance improvement. It's just basically, we're going to punish you, and this is a way for us to document that punishment. Now, there's some times where there does need to be a career cost to something that went wrong. Inappropriately touching employees, for example, lying, stealing, causing, filing false tax returns, breaking the law in the name of the company, posting illegal things on social media in the name of the company. Those are definitely career-ending events, and so those still need to happen, but a PIP is not an appropriate thing for that. A PIP is basically like, look, I think you've got some good, we need to solve this, but I'm going to put you on a formal program so we can make sure this gets taken care of. An alternative dispute resolution is another alternative method for handling these, hence why it's called alternative. It can be getting two parties to come to a resolution. And sometimes, they call this binding arbitration. In the unions, they'll call it binding arbitration. Sometimes when management and the union can't agree on something, they'll agree to go to an arbitrator who basically reads the contract and says, okay, present your case, okay, present your case. And then they sit down and they say, okay, I rule in favor of blank, and here's my reasoning why. And it's binding, so regardless of whether you like the result or not, you have to go do it. And usually it's, I always say I sometimes call these people court type thing. And if you guys aren't old enough to know what the People's Court was, it was a show. It actually was the first show of court drama on TV, where they basically two people are having a disagreement. Usually it's small claims type stuff. They agree to they'll sign a contract that says, look, we'll go on this TV show to get our stuff resolved, and as a result of which we will go ahead and agree to whatever Judge Wapner, who was the name of the judge at that time, whatever Judge Wapner decides for us. Now, he was a retired judge. He wasn't like a lot of these courtroom shows are nowadays. It seems like the judge is all about their star power. Judge Wapner was basically a retired judge who just wanted to was probably approached for this wonderful show idea and said, yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun, I'll go do it. I thought it was a very good show when I was a young kid. Usually if I was homesick, I'd watch it. So But that's kind of how this ends up happening. And sometimes ADRs will be set up for larger organizations, especially where people can have an opportunity to get somebody on the outside to kind of take a look at something if they feel that they're being handled improperly. Employee separation. Obviously, this is the one part of HR that none of us like. Separating an employee from the organization, it's basically like telling somebody you're no longer part of the family. Okay, that's how I've always looked at it. If the separation is happening because they're being terminated. So I talk here about resignation, which is when the employee chooses to leave the organization. And, sometimes what will end up happening is, people will resign for a wide variety of reasons. And so I had a friend of mine who was going to resign and leave the company and decided to put in her notice. And what ended up happening is it's kind of funny because when she put in her resignation notice, somebody who was above the person at the organization that she was putting the notice into noticed that this person was putting in the notice and said, well, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are you leaving? And she says, well, I can't stand so-and-so is constantly harassing me. That started a process that ended up getting that person fired. So there's certain times where people have just they've had enough. They've decided that they're going to leave. Now, as the HR officer, if it brings up a condition that you're not aware of or a situation that you're not aware of, and you think you can fix it, you might be able to convince the employee to stick around. Because you want the person to come and work and do some good things. But if you think some inappropriate stuff is happening, whether it's harassment, could also be illegal stuff. The employee has witnessed illegal things happening. I noticed that, I see drug use on premise. I will tell you that when I was younger, I think it was my fourth bartending job I was working at a club. And two of the managers were cokeheads. They just used cocaine, and you could tell when the cocaine was flowing because they were in a really good mood, and if they were in a really, really crappy mood, you knew that the cocaine wasn't going on. And unfortunately, and it seemed like, and I don't know if this was the truth or not, it seemed like important people knew about it and were willing to tolerate it because they were high-performing individuals. Well, of course they were high-performing individuals. They were high all the time. When they were high performing, and so I worked there for a very short amount of time. Decided to leave because I couldn't put up with it much anymore, and found happier employment. The bad news is when I put in my resignation, nobody really, when I told them, they said, "Why are you leaving?" I said, "Well, so and so keeps using cocaine all the time. I don't want to deal with that." And they were like, "Oh, okay, thank you very much. Have a good day." So it made me feel like the entire organization was in on it, and my understanding is it was discovered later on by somebody who was able to take action, and those two people lost their jobs, and a few others lost their jobs also for tolerating it. So it can be one of those things that sometimes a resignation can trigger an investigation, sometimes it won't, but who knows? Maybe several people had quit, and the person who was able to take action on this was like, why are we losing 4 or 5 people? And all of a sudden got a hold of one of them and said, why are you guys leaving? Oh, we're leaving because so-and-so uses cocaine all the time. That might have been what happened. I don't know. I wasn't there. But like I said, it was eventually dealt with, and all that. So there could be a whole lot of reasons why people try to do separation. Now, again, as we said earlier, the worst part of the HR is when you have to terminate an employee. It's, and the way it kind of feels is that you're telling a family member that they're not going to be here anymore. And so obviously it can hurt. It hurts people, who knew the person, and sometimes sometimes people are terminated for justifiable reasons. We caught you lying, we caught you stealing, we caught you doing this, we caught you doing that, and so on and so forth. And so it's a pretty justifiable thing. Now the problem is that as HR, when somebody is terminated, you're not supposed to discuss why that person was terminated. Now I think nobody in this audience is going to agree with me if I said that's what always happens. Somehow the information usually tends to leak out, and that's, you know, but it's most important that it doesn't come from us, because we are the sacred holders of protected information in that sense. So we want to make sure that it is protected as much as possible. And there are people who are going to be terminated for those disciplinary reasons. And sometimes, like I said, if it becomes well known and it's seen as unfair, it can cause an issue of low morale. I remember we had I was working at a firm. And once we got done with tax season, tax season, of course, ended April 15th. I remember about the first week of May, I had been told that one of my friends at the firm was being let go. And I was sitting there going, what gives? And of course, he was gone. And we were friends at the work. We weren't friends outside of work. Luckily, I did, he had reached out to me by email and said, hey, Kevin, what's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And I said, what's your personal email address? And we talked to each other afterwards and we can find out. And I said, well, why is it that you were let go? And he said, well, and he told me the whole story, and it just didn't seem right. And so, and the other thing that really bothered me about it is that several people who had been at the firm for many years seemed to be okay with this. And I kind of, eventually I started asking around, because, I was an older person for my relatively low my low level. And I said, well, what's going on? They said, well, periodically this firm, what they do is they like to, once tax season gets over, they like to trim problem people. And so what it does is that it lowers costs for them, but at the same time, and I think somebody once said that it's like what Jack Welch always recommended, that fire your lowest 10% of your performers, in order to keep your organization constantly rising and rising. I've having seen that the human side of that, my personal opinion is I'm not so sure that the firm did a whole lot in order to try to keep the individual, but it is something that I wish that that could have been handled a little bit differently. So then they talk a little bit here about performance appraisals. Make sure you got your ducks in a row when you're going to fire somebody for questionable performance. We'll talk about this more in Chapter 10 when we talk about employee assessment. Remember that if the discipline process is followed as outlined prior, termination for non-performance should never be a surprise to an employee. Okay, so if you're walking into the employee's office and saying, we're terminating you for horrible performance, and they're kind of like, what? Something probably went wrong. Now, I've never seen a situation where somebody's terminated for poor performance that it was a surprise to them, and it shouldn't be. Depending on contracts, they may be entitled to a severance package. This is a very common thing when you start getting into salaried positions, where people will say, hey, if you're terminated for whatever reason, we're going to at least give you somewhat of a severance package. Even this friend of mine who got terminated from the firm, I think he had gotten something like a 6-week severance package or something like that. So he got a severance package, then he went right on to unemployment. So what ended up happening is it ended up actually working out for him, because he eventually landed another job. He's still working there, and this was many, many years ago that this had taken place. So I know he found happiness where he was. If you are going to do a severance package, preferably before anyone is terminated, you might want to make sure that you include the following: how the severance will be paid, what situations the severance will be paid and which ones won't. A formula for how severance is paid, legal documents such as legal releases and non-competes. And here's the thing. Usually if you're going to do a severance package, there has to be some sort of consideration given. We do the severance package as a form of consideration in exchange for something else. And legal documents to make sure that they're signed so that there's non-compete agreements is usually one of them. Now, we always have, if you're going to have them do like non-compete agreements, or if you're going to do non-disclosure agreements, probably the employee is going to be signing those already as is. But generally speaking, and here's the thing: when you talk about non-compete agreements, we don't talk too much about law at this point. Well, I mean, we have off and on in the class. But if you're going to have somebody sign a non-compete agreement, especially if you're going to tell them you can't compete against us while you're on severance, you're going to have to offer them a substantial form of compensation to pay them not to compete with you. In other words, say for example, I work for a small, work in a small town. I work for an accounting firm, and they tell me, we're going to let you go because we're thinning out the herd, and we want you to sign this non-compete agreement because we don't want you to compete against us because we're letting you go. If I'm working in a small town, it's unrealistic for me to be able to find suitable employment, and as a result of which, you better be paying me if you're going to expect me to be able to do this. And so there is some rules and law that do require that. So you want to make sure that that gets all taken care of. And again, sometimes it's better to have a lawyer take a look at these things and say, this is a procedure that we're going to do. Just give us an idea as to whether or not this is a good idea or not. They talk about absconded employees. If an employee stops showing up to work, good faith, contact. You tend to see this. I used to see this a lot when I was working at McDonald's and in the restaurant industry. Somebody would get hired, and then they show up to orientation, and then 2 weeks later they're gone, and you have no idea where they are. You try contacting, because the first thing that usually we're worried about is the person dead? We're worried. Did the person die? So we're calling them. They're not answering our phone calls because they don't want to talk to us anymore. We get concerned, and then we talk to 4 or 5 other people, and we find out, oh no, he's fine. He just doesn't want to work for you anymore. Oh, well, okay. So in that case, it would be prudent to stop pay and seek legal help to recover any company items that you may have. Now, again, like I said, I tend to see this a lot more in hourly wages, where they're probably not going to be given a whole lot of employee property, other than maybe uniforms, which the company could just write off, and it's not a big deal. And all that sort of stuff. Right-sizing and layoffs. Right-sizing refers to the process of reducing total size of employees to ultimately save costs. And I always hate this term right-sizing. That just makes it sound like, to me, right-sizing is seen as a way to justify, or as a way to feel better about a process that nobody's happy about. Downsizing is a horrible time, because you are about to lay off. In many cases, where especially if there's a really bad economy going on, you may lay off 10, 15, 20% of your employees for whatever reason. I told you in a previous video I was downsized, laid off because of, and I didn't know it at the time, but the company was going to sell to another firm, an accounting firm, and the purchasing accounting firm said, you got to thin the herd by 20% or we're not going to bring you on board. And so they just went out and just took 20% of the 20% of the heads, and they just and I was one of them, because I'd only been at the company for about 4 months, and they figured it was easier for me. It was cheaper because they only gave me 2 weeks of severance pay. But you're letting people go. They're not going to be paid anymore, and so that's never fun. And especially if you're the person who has to constantly bring people in and say that, hey, look, we're letting you go. We can't tell you a whole lot of details as the full reason why, but these are the reasons not why. Like I remember when I was brought in for my layoff, they sat me down and they said, Kevin, we're going to let you go. And I said, did I do everything all right? Am I in trouble or anything of that nature? They said, no, you've done nothing wrong. In fact, and she kind of went back to her little checklist. She said, look, your layoff is not due to blah, 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 blah. It's not due to bad performance. It's not due to, because I had never been counseled for bad performance. I had never been talked to about for bad performance. And so all of a sudden to be laid off, I thought was kind of like jumping the gun if they were going to be mad at me. But they weren't. And so it was just because of the sale. They couldn't tell me it was the sale because that was part of the thing. It was supposed to be a secret. And so they didn't tell me anything about it. And so I just left. And, for me, it was actually really good. I got about 2 weeks off. I was on unemployment for a little while. I got to play a lot of golf. And then once August rolled around, that's when hiring season for the next season for tax accountants happened. I walked right into a job at a much happier job. That's when I landed at my third firm that I've infamously talked about. So there's nothing, they talk about nothing worse than laying off people. an organization, and obviously we try very hard whenever possible to find alternative ways to reduce costs. Cost-cutting measures. We're going to reduce budgets in various things. Maybe we get rid of the free food platter that shows up every day. Maybe we get, maybe we cut down on some of the electricity that we use in the building. Oh, we got half of our office spaces aren't being used. Let's go ahead and move everybody into one side of the office, and then we'll darken the other half so that we can at least save power. There's various little things that people will try to do in order to save money because they don't want to let people go. And there's two reasons why you don't want to let people go. Number one, it's painful. It's painful for you. It's painful for the employee. It's painful for those who remain. There's a lot of people who are going to see, that they survived, and we have what we call we call it a syndrome. It's survivor syndrome, where if you are at a drastic turn, there's been some times where there's been a natural disaster where a significant size of the population gets killed in this, and there's certain other people who survive, and the first thing they start asking themselves is, why me? Some people find purpose in this. Others, they get into a depression and they can't get out of it. And so you have to have, and this is why when you do these kind of right sizing, it doesn't hurt to have some counseling services that are available for the people who are still sticking around. But you also want to have counseling services for those who are not sticking around, because of sometimes they are going to go through depressions, of course, too. The second reason why we want to make sure that we're not doing downsizes, if the downturn is temporary and we need to bring people back, okay, optimally, when you let people go, you're going to be like, hey, look, we're going to have like a 6-month period or a 1-year period where you'll be subject to recall. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to come back, but it basically says, look, we're going to hire you first to come back to work for us if the downturn turns around and all of a sudden we're back in a good spot. Okay, because we want to hire people who actually know us already, and we want to bring people back into the organization. I've actually met one person who had this happen to them. They were laid off. They went to go work for someone else, and then 7 months later they got a phone call saying, hey, things are good again, would you like to come back and work for us? And at first, his initial answer was, no, I don't want to work for you guys anymore. But he said, look, let me think about it. He didn't say that, or he didn't mention that to them. He said, let me think about it. And eventually he decided to go back, and he said he was actually pretty happy to go back because he knew the culture, he knew what was going on. They actually ended up bringing the person that he actually got a small bump up in position as a result of this. It doesn't always work out that way, but when it did happen for him, it was actually a very good thing to happen for him. So but like I said, the person could have come back and said, no, I found a job, I'm very happy, thank you very much, I really appreciate you considering me, thank you, goodbye, click. You want to be polite because obviously you don't want to burn bridges, but anyways. So and they talk about methods when you're going to do this. You've decided the only way to reduce costs is cut full-time employees. We get involved. Usually legal counsel gets involved to make sure that we're doing everything correctly. And then we also want to establish criteria ahead of time in order to help avoid managers trying to save people from their own departments. After the criteria, the next phase would be to sit down with management, decide who does or does not meet the criteria and who will be laid off. At this point, before the layoffs begins, makes sense to discuss severance packages. Usually an employee signs for a severance package, and the employee should also sign a form that releases the organization from future claims by the employee. This is very standard and common. And we haven't talked about it here yet, but there's actually some legal issues as a result of this. Where the Warren Act, usually if you have a mass layoff, you have to give them 60 days of notice prior to the layoffs being announced. And so what it does is that and it's not just for the employees of the organization, but it's also the community at large. Because what happens is, especially if you have a major employer, this happened in Spokane, Washington when I was young longer. Kaiser is an aluminum processing company, and they had 2 plants in Spokane, Washington, one in Spokane Valley and one in Spokane, North Spokane. And the aluminum business just went, it just died. And as a result of which, they laid off tons and tons of people. Now, they were all unionized, so they actually had better deals than what would be announced otherwise. But I remember when they did the mass layoffs, it really affected Spokane's economy too. And so there were a lot of people who were very negatively affected as a result of that. So that's part of the reason why they do that. All right, so in this section, we're going to talk about employee rights. The learning objectives for this section are going to be to explain the employee rights and also define unions and explain their relations to the HRM function. So the first thing we talk about with the employee rights is job protection rights. If the HR doesn't understand properly manage employee rights, lawsuits are sure to follow. That is, especially here in the United States, that is a foregone conclusion. Because when somebody gets laid off and they don't think that they should have been laid off, first thing they do is they go get one of these ambulance chasers who's going to try and sue you up ways, down ways, and 6 ways to Sunday. So sometimes, and again, if we don't do our job, we've really just opened up the door for employees to come and take legal action as a result of it. In the United States, the at-will employment principle is the right of an employer to fire an employee or an employee leaves an organization at any time. So employment at will, and we kind of talk a little bit about this. You have the right as an employee to leave at any point. We can't force you to stay, okay? Just at the same time, the employer has a right to say, look, this relationship's not going good, we're going to terminate. And it kind of comes down to, certain basic fundamental rights that we have in the U.S. Constitution that basically says we can't force people to work for us. There's this thing called the 14th Amendment that did away from that, thank God. But, at the same time, it also brings up this also on the opposite side. If the employer doesn't want the person to work there anymore, they have the right to say, I don't want you to work here anymore. Now, there are certain exceptions to these rules, and one of the exceptions that they say is public policy exception. So, for example, an employer may not fire an employee if it would violate the individual state's doctrines or statutes. They talk about the Burris versus Pierce goods shop in Pennsylvania, where they said that it ruled that Pennsylvania law may protect at-will employees from being fired for refusing to take part in a drug program if the private employee's privacy is invalidated. So that's just kind of where they're kind of talking about sometimes there may be a statute requirement to perform certain actions, and as a result of which you cannot be fired from doing that, or you shouldn't be able to be fired from it if for example, it would violate other rights as a result of that. The implied contract exception. In a breach of employee contract, the discharged employee can prove that the employer indicated that the employee had job security. And this is where, this kind of makes my head hurt sometimes. Sometimes we sit down and we want to be nice to our employees, right? So sometimes when and I've had employees that I've worked for, I've actually been the guy who usually stresses out a lot. But when you have an employee who constantly stresses out a lot, and you just want them to sit down and relax, and look, you have nothing to worry about. You have the person who's constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering if they're going to get fired tomorrow. And sometimes you just want to sit down with them and say, look, sit down, shut up, and do your job. There's nothing to worry about. You can't necessarily, you have to be careful about doing that, of course, because then you have an implied contract exception. Where they talked about here, the indication does not need to be formally written, only implied. And then they talk about the Wright versus Honda, where an employee was terminated, argued that an implied contract exception was relevant to the employee at will doctrine. She was able to prove that in orientation, Honda stressed to its employees the importance of attendance and quality work. Now, step back for a few seconds here. And I want to talk about something that I think is very important. Sometimes you're going to find out that certain things we talk about in this class are going to conflict with each other. Honda, being a Japanese company, and yours truly, having lived and worked in Japan, I think I know of which I speak when I say this. Japanese companies tend to have certain cultural values, shall we say, and I talked to you in a previous class. I believe it was on the subject of motivation in chapter 5, where we talked about theory X, theory Y, and then I talked about theory Z, which is the Ouchi model. The Ouchi model was based off of Japanese management, where the company is sort of paternalistic with the employee. And as a result of which, you're seeing it. Your company is essentially your family, okay? And for example, I mean, I don't think they do this as much anymore. They used to do it back in the '80s, especially, where they would have a company song that people would get together and sing in the morning before they went to work. They would have, they would get out and they would do field exercises together, in order to get, exercise and all that sort of stuff. So there's this sort of paternalistic relationship that a lot of Japanese companies have. And so if we're going to sit down and we're going to say, look, you have to be in a multicultural environment, these are certain things that are going to take place. But you can see where sometimes multiculturalism runs into the law. It's like a brick wall. It's a brick wall. I don't know too much about the case. I'm not trying to suggest that Honda was justified in what it did. But she was able to prove that in orientation they stressed the importance of attendance and quality work. And also able to prove the language in the Associate Handbook implied job security. The job security of each employee depends on doing your best on your job with a spirit of cooperation. That is the most Japanese thing that you could say. I remember, I could probably actually say this in Japanese, because I remember I've heard it a lot. They talk about cooperation, they talk about harmony with one, and a whole lot of different things. And so I could understand why they would have put this statement in there. I don't think they argued it before the judge very properly, if that's the case, and they could have approached it from that angle. Again, I don't know if she got fired because, she was a horrible worker, or if she got wrongfully terminated. I'm not trying to justify what Honda did, but I do think that, I find it interesting that, this is an area where multiculturalism and the law sometimes can run into one another. Good faith and fair dealing exception. The good faith and fair dealing exception, the discharged employee contends that he was not treated fairly. The exception of the at-will employment is less common than the first two. And here's the thing. It's not that good. It's not that fairness is a legal requirement, but generally speaking, if it's not seen, it can sometimes overturn some of these decisions. For example, if you say that you had a policy where, say you did the matrix, and this person did a few level 1, like I said, with the matrix, we talked about disciplinary steps, and then we talked about seriousness of the offense. Say that's level 1, so it's all basic. And maybe they had only done 2 events, and then all of a sudden they jumped from the written warning to you're fired, without going through the other steps. That could set you up for a good faith and fair dealing exception. However, if you follow the procedure and policy that you write out for your company, you'll have no problems. Again, showing favoritism sometimes can be seen that way. Generally speaking, you're not going to see this too much. I think it's harder to prove, and I remember talking to a lawyer about this once, about good faith and fair dealings. He says it was very difficult to prove in many cases, because what ends up happening is, they said, well, we're at will termination, and we just decided we didn't want to work with the person anymore. And then the person has to go back and literally show examples, get people to testify on their behalf. Well, if they still work for the company, they ain't going to testify. But if those people don't work for the company anymore, do they have credibility? And that's part of the issue that you end up running into when you have the good faith and fair dealing exceptions, unfortunately. They talk about state acceptance of at-will exceptions. And so, they give you all the states, all 50 states. So as you look, finish up with the states, they talk about one of the exceptions can be proven wrongful discharge accusations may occur. The United States is one of the few major industrial powers that uses at-will employment. Most countries, including France and the UK, require employers to show just cause for termination of an employee's performance or employment. This is a double-edged sword, though. Obviously we want, I'm all for employee rights, and don't get me wrong on that, but I've seen where this can get abused. And so, I'm very much in favor of the way we do things here in the United States. I've had friends of mine who have worked over in Europe, and on one hand they said it was wonderful, but one of the things that they also talked about in Europe, there's far less regulations when hiring employees than there is here in the United States. And it's just because usually with the recruiting aspect of things, we tend to, because it's so legalistic, employees also, it gets to the point where, and in fact I was actually talking to a gentleman who's a manager for a German company here, and he's British because he used to live in England. He was talking to me about, he said, hiring somebody here in the UK, I could get it done in like a week. Here in the United States, I've got to fill out this form, I got to do that form, I got to do this form, and I got to get this done, and I got to write out job description, I got to do job analysis and all that. So we don't have to do any of this stuff over in England. So, there's two positives to it, or two negatives to it, depending on how you see it. But like I said, I prefer the way that we do it here in the United States, because I've seen over there, where some people have abused the system where they don't get fired, even though they're grossly inadequate for the job. So they talk about whistleblowing. If you work in the federal government, obviously you know a whole lot about whistleblowing and everything. So I'm not going to go too much into that. But if you don't work in the federal government, or you haven't noticed too much about whistleblowing, they talk a little bit about it down here, and it's really become front and center lately because of the Edward Snowden case. Now, mind you, as an individual who used to work in a classified environment, I have no sympathy for Snowden at all. And I'm sorry, and if that's a political statement that people don't want to hear, I'm sorry. But having worked in a classified environment, I know that I was entrusted with a trust to maintain the security of the information that was given to me. And no matter how angry I could ever get at people that I worked for, I would never do anything to betray that trust. Maybe it's because I just, I love America so much. But on the other hand, he said that he saw some things that were going on that he didn't agree with, and that he thought was a violation of the law. The federal government does have whistleblowing procedures to say, look, we don't think this is legal. And so there's outside organizations that can be done, and I say outside organizations, it's usually within the organization, but it's outside of the process. Inspector generals, we talked a little bit about the in the news they've talked a little bit about the Inspector General's office, like of the FBI or of some of the or the Justice Department. Those people work out on the outside and will investigate anything when somebody comes to them with a whistleblower type case. So it's not that they don't exist. Normally, of course, smaller organizations won't have this. A lot larger organizations will try to have whistleblower protections, mostly because if you are a publicly traded corporation, there are whistleblower protections that are required as a result of all that stuff. So constructive discharge means the employee resigned, but only because work conditions were so intolerable that he or she had no choice. That's kind of what I was talking about, my friend who had been sexually harassed at work and decided she didn't want to work there anymore. The WARN Act, we talked about this a little bit earlier. They say 60 days notice affecting 50 or more full-time employees. It does not apply in the case of unforeseeable business circumstances. Good example, you're working at a power plant. There's 1,000 employees working at this power plant. A natural disaster comes in and wipes the whole darn thing out. The company doesn't have to say, okay, well, you still have a job for 60 days. I mean, it's kind of impractical. It's unforeseeable. It's not like the business went out there and called the hurricane and said, please wipe out our plant so that we can fire people. It's not that way. So, but that's, unforeseeable circumstances. If the employer violates, he can be subject for back pay. Does not include workers who have been with the organization for less than 6 months. Retaliatory discharge is where they talk about punishment of an employee for engaging in a protected activity. For example, you file an EEOC complaint and you want to terminate the employee, that could be seen as retaliatory. And that's why when I told you guys, when we talked about this in Chapter 3 and some of the other chapters, you have an employee who files an EEOC complaint, stop, call the lawyer, sit down, talk to the lawyer, and do whatever she says. Okay? The lawyer will tell you what you can do and what you can't do. Don't try to be John Wayne. Don't try to go solve this on your own. Don't say, I can go have a cup of coffee with the individual and get this thing solved. Don't do any of that. It's not worth it. So you want to make sure that you sit down with your lawyer first, and then he or she is going to tell you what you can and cannot get away with as for certain things. And that same lawyer could also be negotiating with the other lawyer to say, look, we're going to set up, in order to prevent a retaliatory situation, we want to set up guidelines and rules. Maybe we sit down and talk about that. And oftentimes the other lawyer is going to be happy to do that, because as long as the rules are followed and their employee continues to receive work, the employee continues to get paid, which means the lawyer can get paid. I don't mean to put it down to selfishness, but that is definitely something that that needs to be worried about. Privacy rights, I remember, in the 1950s, they used to talk about how they thought, the Soviets were spying on everything that we were doing, and nobody wanted to be spied upon, and, and everybody was very concerned about their freedoms and all that sort of stuff, and they thought that, the Reds are coming, and now all of a sudden we have Alexis, in our home. We have Google in our home. Google's on my phone here, and it knows every direction that I've gone because it's got a GPS on it. I would probably say if I told somebody from the 1950s about all the stuff that I do on my phone, they'd probably be like, whoa, how is that not a violation of your rights? Well, and again, it's a changing environment that we're having in the United States as a result of this. And they talk about privacy concerns, including monitoring postings on the external websites. Companies such as Social Sentry under contract monitor employee postings such as Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Lawyers warn, however, this type of monitoring should only be done if the employee is consented. There's a portion of me that sees both sides on this. I'm an avid Facebooker. I linked with everybody. By the way, if you want to link with me, and you want to link with me on LinkedIn, please feel free to do so at any time. I love linking with students, and I've had students who've come back to me 6 months later. Usually what they'll do is they'll find out that I had a work anniversary, because I've got about 4 or 5 work anniversaries. I do 4 or 5 different jobs. And they'll say, oh, wow, congratulations on your work anniversary. I'm like, wow, I haven't talked to you in a while. How are things going? And all of a sudden I find out, oh, yeah, thanks to your class and thanks to the degree I got at UMUC, I got this wonderful job promotion and everything's wonderful. I love hearing stories like that. So I would be very happy if you guys would want to link with me. But I've also had some times where people have reached out to me and said, hey, I need help getting into the HR community because I'm trying to transfer from one industry and get into the HR community. Can you help me out? And sometimes I've been able to help people with resume writing. Sometimes I've been able to help people with other things. So it's been a very good thing. I would just say, look, if you have time, go ahead and link with me and I'll be happy to do it. But sometimes we do monitoring. You want to make sure that it's being consented. And this can be, generally you want to get consent for a couple reasons anyways. You don't want the employee to find out that you're monitoring their stuff and all of a sudden have a hissy fit about it. You probably want, I would recommend getting the consent, especially if you're working in some of these states that tend to have tighter privacy laws. But I've talked to some other lawyers about this and they said, hey, look, wait a minute, if you're putting something out on social media, it is no longer yours anymore. It is now belongs to the public domain, particularly if you have an account that's got a setting that says, I let God and everybody see this. You have no expectation of privacy. And so I'm a little, can you monitor? I mean, I've done, back when I was much younger and dumber, I would, Facebook, I had Facebook with many of my managers. If I said anything that was disrespectful to the Navy, they could come after me for it. And not that I think that they were trying to spy on me so much, but they were like, you know, hey, we're all friends, let's all friend up and everything of that nature. And so it worked out, you know, like my LinkedIn, and I probably have 2,000 connections. It's everybody that I've ever known, and then a whole bunch of people that I probably don't know. I do have a lot of people who link with me that, quite frankly, you know, they're trying to sell me something. But you know, like I said, I'm always willing to do an introduction if it's somebody that you need to get in touch with, because it can help you with your job opportunities. They talk about the U.S. Patriot Act, which includes caveats to privacy when investigating possible terrorism activity. You know, this has gotten, I believe it's been updated. I mean, it's been you know, not what is it? Continued. It's gone continued. But I know there were some changes to it. I'll be honest, I haven't followed this as much as I probably should have under the Patriot Act. But it did allow for government monitoring of business accounts for possible terrorism links, and they don't have to tell you about it. You won't even know about that's going on until you know, one day you have it where the FBI shows up and says, "Look, we need to go talk to so and so," and next thing you know, they're being escorted out the building. That's kind of how that happens. Depending on the state you live in, and let me talk a little bit about states. And I talked about this in a previous class. We focus in this class on federal law. Okay, we focus on federal law. We do not focus on state law. As a result of that, we want you to, you know, we want you to understand federal law when we talk about federal law. When you get done with this degree and you go into the human resources world, if you go into human resources, it is imperative on you to learn your local and state laws. And again, you know, and look, full disclosure, I get paid nothing to do this. I have no incentive to do this, that, you know, other than, you know, periodically somebody reaches out to me and says thank you. You know, SHRM is probably one of the best organizations to be a member of in order to keep up with this, because what ends up happening with SHRM is you can go to these you know, you go to these CEs, continuing education classes, where you learn about a lot of this stuff. You interact with people, you learn about various things within your state and local community. And sometimes, you know, if you really want to get involved with SHRM, you can get involved with the local policy activism. I'm a member of a group called the Committee for Global Immigration, CFGI, and one of the things that we're really working on is lobbying Congress to increase the number of H-1B visas, because we're having labor shortages in various industries due to the wonderful economy that we're having here, and also the lack of appropriately trained individuals coming out of college. So we want to get H-1B visas so these people can stay, they can work, and be well taken care of. And there's a lot of misconceptions about H-1B visas that, you know, and I don't want to go into that. If I do, that's going to eat up so much more time than we actually have. But I implore you, please get involved with your local SHRM chapter or whatever organization that you're going to join in order to keep up with your continuing education, so that you can learn what happens in your state and local jurisdictions that we can't cover in this class. Okay, old man ranting over. They talk about drug testing and right to privacy is a delicate balancing act. Organizations that implement drug testing often do so for insurance or safety reasons. Because of the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988, this is where federal contractors and federal grantees must agree that they will provide a drug-free workplace as a condition of obtaining the contract. In order to do that, you have to do drug tests. Now, I haven't taken a drug test since I left the military. To be honest, I've never given anybody a reason to want to do a drug test on me since leaving the military. So I would say that most organizations that I've worked for don't do this as much. However, it could be one of those things where, you know, maybe, you know, I mean, I'm an accounting firm. I guess, you know, making sure that my employees are drug-free is an important thing. But again, it's something that I don't like to, I don't want to harp on too much, but it is definitely a very delicate act. It says the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, does not view testing for illegal drugs as a medical examination, making them legal, and people using illegal drugs are not protected under the ADA. Now, I'll step back for a second because I want to talk about something that I'm sure that probably is going on in people's minds as we're thinking about this right now. Full disclosure, I'm a member of a group called CPA Connect. Last year in 2017, I had joined, and so I decided that this last year I had enough money. I was actually going to go to the first year's conference. They held it in Colorado. Colorado at that time was one of only 2 states that had legalized recreational use of marijuana. And then there are multiple other states that are legalizing medical use of marijuana if they've got an appropriate doctor's prescription. To let you know something, this is where you're going to have this, and this is why I said get involved with your local and state laws, because what ends up happening is you could be correct under the federal law for terminating somebody for popping positive for an illegal drug such as marijuana. But the state may have enacted certain protections for that individual that you could end up falling under. So yes, you have a right to, under the federal law, say well, first of all, if you're a government contractor and you say that you're going to have a drug-free workplace and somebody pops positive for weed, you've got to terminate them. And so it could be an issue. And I'm sure that state laws, first of all, if state laws were to go ahead and instigate protections to say you can't fire somebody for using recreational drugs, they would run afoul of the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988. And I think they would lose in court. In order to make this whole thing get solved and settled, Congress is just going to have to take action. And I don't anticipate Congress taking action anytime soon. The current administration has not indicated they wanted to do anything. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if the current POTUS would want to do something. He doesn't strike me as a person who's, very strong or passionate on the topic, but I know the vice president is. And then, the Senate being in the hands of the Republicans, I think Senator McConnell on multiple occasions has said he doesn't want to do it. But there are other Republicans who do. Senator Rand Paul has mentioned on many occasions we shouldn't be doing it, but he's very libertarian, and that would make sense. So I just don't see it being something that's resolved until something happens where somebody says, look, I've fired this person because under certain federal laws I had to terminate them, or I had the right to terminate them. State laws had protections for them. I'm going to take it to court. And I'm kind of surprised. I mean, we've had, and like I said, when we went to this conference, I actually asked a few people who worked in Colorado, because there were a few of the member firms that were working with Colorado, and I asked them, I said, hey, what do you think about this? I mean, is this something that you've run into as a law? And there's a whole host of things that have been running into problems. One of the biggest problems that we've had in the accounting industry is auditing companies that sell marijuana is a very precarious thing to get involved with, because technically you are auditing a company that is performing an illegal act under federal law, but under state law they're not performing an illegal act. However, a lot of these companies, because of the nature of what they do need audits to be done. And it, like I said, I think a lot of it hasn't been resolved yet. I think it's not going to get resolved until one of two things happens. Either all these states stop legalizing weed, which I don't see happening anytime soon, or two, Congress eventually says, look, we're just going to have to legalize it, but we're going to control the heck out of it. We're going to tax the heck out of it. And by the way, ATF is going to be put in charge of doing all that stuff. I just don't see it happening any other way. They say in organizations where heavy machinery is operated, a monthly drug test may be a requirement. In fact, under the Omnibus Transportation Employee Act of 1991, are legally required to test drugs in transportation-related businesses such as airlines, railroads, trucking, and public transportation, such as the bus system. Again, it's being, and they talked a little bit about it. I nuked this topic, so I'm not going to talk about medical marijuana anymore. Labor unions. So a union is an organization of employees formed to bargain with an employer. And if you think about it, there's strength in numbers. I've worked in an organization where I was a member of a union. And I think that the union I've worked in an organization where I've dealt with unions where I wasn't a member of the union. And so I've seen it on many ways. We'll talk more about this in greater detail in Chapter 11, but the labor union has been part of the U.S. workplace since the 1920s, but the Wagner Act of 1935 significantly impacted them, which basically said there's certain unfair labor practices that were being addressed by the Wagner Act. Labor Relations Board, the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, is responsible for administering and enforcing provisions of the Wagner Act. The Act makes such as interfering with the formation of unions and discriminating on the basis of union membership illegal for employees. So during this is one of those illegal questions you can't ask. Are you a member of a union? Have you ever been a member of a union? You're never gonna ask that. Unless you have a contract with a union that basically says you will only hire union workers for these specific jobs, then you do have to ask, are you a member of the union? Because if you're not a member of the union, I can't hire you. All right, because I've signed a contract in order to do that. But you can't act, are you a past member of the union, if you're a company that has no union. You're just not allowed to do that. And so what ended up happening with unions, and let me step back a little bit with this. Unions became really popular, particularly in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were really popular in Europe and were seen as sort of a hotbed of communist and socialist activities. So needless to say, the United States was pretty harsh against them in the initial upbringings of them. And eventually, once we got past the 20s, labor unions started increasing, and then, of course, when FDR became president, the Wagner Act was passed in 1935. And then started sort of a process where Congress and the president have kind of gone, well, I wouldn't say the president, mostly Congress, have gone back and forth, where they've kind of said, we're going to pass a law that really helps the unions, and then we're going to pass a law that really hurts the unions. Then we're going to pass a law that helps the unions, then we're going to pass a law that hurts the unions. And you start seeing some of that here. So they talk about, the Wagner Act in 35, but by the mid-40s, 9 million people were members of the union, which spurred the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. This act set a new standards of fair practices by the unions within the unionized environment. This was a non-friendly union bill. Basically what it did, the Wagner Act pretty much said, these are the things you can't do anymore if you have employees who are members of the union or if they want to form a union. What they began to realize is that unions were beginning to abuse some of those rules, and as a result of which the Taft-Hartley Act came into effect and basically said, look, these are some standards that you have to operate within if you're going to be doing this. And I think by now we've seen in the United States, I would say unions really reached their height probably in the 60s. Maybe the 70s. I'd say once we started getting to around the 80s and the 90s, unions started really waning a lot, and so they're not as prominent as they used to be in the past. Unions used to have wonderful benefits. It used to be a juicy pension system. Of course, a lot of it was funded by the company, but it was also funded by the union. They used to have great health care. Where they said, look, we're going to take care of you from cradle to grave. You want to come here and you want to work and you want to build cars for the rest of your life, we're going to take care of it. You want to go into management? Once you go into management, now you're no longer one of us. I don't think they were always necessarily negative on them, but it did sometimes, when people promoted within the union to go into management, sometimes it could create a little bit of an interesting situation. They talk about here that you need to understand the contract. That contract is your guiding principle when dealing with union employees. You have to be very involved with understanding how that contract works, what you can say, what you can't say. And I remember I used to see a lot of human resource officers that I had worked with companies in the past. And then I went to go work at the Doubletree Hotel, where we had this was my first experience where I was a member of the union working with this company. And I could tell that She was, you know, it was her, and then there was, you know, the lady that worked for her. But their demeanor was very different when dealing with us versus the non-union employees, because there were some employees that were not union, and then there was it was food services and housekeeping were unionized. And so when they dealt with us, there was one way that they behaved. When they dealt with other employees, there was a different way they behaved, and we kind of could see that. Later on, we ended up deunionizing, which was an interesting process to watch, because, you know, if you've never seen that happen before, it can be very interesting. You have to understand the contract, know it, live it, love it, do it. That's all I'm going to talk about with that. So this chapter only had 2 parts to it. That's all I got for this time. Actually, we went a little longer than I expected. I appreciate you guys watching this video. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out to me. If you're in my class, you know what my email address is. If you're not in my class, please feel free to leave a comment in the box below, and then I will be able to respond to the comment as need be. I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video.